Good morning, Anthem Church. We are entering the fall together, and with that, I want to be intentional in our sermon series to really look at what is most important to God for Anthem Church. And we are entering our third year together. I'm excited about what's ahead, and so let's really focus in on what we need to be best at as we begin this fall together.
So what gets you up on a Sunday morning? Is it the worship? Is it an opportunity for fellowship or for your kids to learn about God? Maybe it's just the right thing to do. The Huffington Post reported that 80% of Americans find more fulfilling things to do on a Sunday morning. And so reasons given were that church gathering together is irrelevant, Christians are hypocritical, you don't find friends, you don't grow spiritually. I think Lifeway research also found that an increasing percentage of people are not attending. In 2018, about 58% were not attending. Now that's grown to about 68% are not attending in 2022. Interestingly, their advice was give people a reason to belong. With less people going to a Sunday morning gathering, what draws Christians together? What's important to God when we come together as a church? There's many ideas. I think about the 90s when I was a kid, and it was about attractional churches and drawing in people by being more palatable in terms of the singing and the sermon. And then in the 2000s, it kind of moved into being distinctive and unique, maybe even being a bit abrasive, just trying to stand out. And then the 2010s started this really big emphasis on small groups. I think about my experience in the church. It really stood out to me when I was at Torchbearer Bible School and Lagai and I were serving there on staff. We saw a lot of churches, and one church really stood out to us. They felt like family. They knew each other personally. They walked with each other, journeyed for years together through the highs and the lows of life. And it was really being a part of that experience of seeing that church that Lagai and I started to think through, man, we love being at a Bible school, but to journey with people in life together, to share life together at the church, that's what we want to be about. And that's where we headed and started looking for opportunities to serve in the church and to be on staff. And we knew that's what we wanted. And it also then created this kind of idealized church for us. And we know that there's no perfect church, but it makes me think for myself and us as a church is, what's your ideal for a church? Is it having worship with smoke and lights? Is it having potluck every week? Maybe it's to have a building, not to rent. Maybe for you, it's actually just to have a church that gets along together, that there's no conflict. And I think the issue is that our ideals shape our expectations, so that this vision that we have of what church is supposed to be now translates into our expectations for what we want of our church today. And I think the reality of Anthem Church as we enter our third year together, we're not a new church any longer. We're not as shiny as we were a few years ago. We're still small, and so for each person, I know it can feel like it requires more. And I think for me, the concerns that I have is that if we focus on what's missing or what we lack, I think we can start to take each other for granted. And I think we can start to miss out on God's grace that He's providing for us, and maybe even to start to lose faith. And so as we enter a new season together, I really want us to refocus on God's priority for Anthem Church. There's many things we can do. There's one thing that we have to do really well. And that's what we're going to look at today. And it really is the one thing that gives reason for people to belong. Paul understood this. He started a fruitful ministry in a city of Corinth. And a few years in, the problems started to surface. There was division. There was people sleeping around together. There were worship wars, people disagreeing. And people had ideas. They said, man, if we just had faith to move mountains, or if we were more spiritual, speaking in tongues, if we had more knowledge, or if we helped the poor. And Paul, as he is hearing this feedback, he's saying it's not about us. It's about who we follow. It's about Jesus. And he calls us into a community to be an expression of his love and to share in his heart for the whole world. It's about his work in us. And so the solution to this church that he's writing to in the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, is to embody Jesus, embody his love. And now, before I lose you, this isn't some kind of self-help ideology. This isn't going to be about a Disney message. We're talking about how the work of Jesus transforms us to love supernaturally. Paul believed this love defined the ideal church, and it was the key to the longevity and the growth of the church that he was writing to. And so what I want for us today is, as we reflect on these verses, to let this redefine our ideal of our church, according to 1 Corinthians 13. And so you'll see here in the passage, I start in verse 4, but starting in verse 1 of chapter 13, it's really Paul speaking into those ideas that people had for the ideal church. That's verses 1 to 3. And then he then wants to redefine and focus on the ideal of the church, which is to be a church known for love. And that's verses 4 to 8. And so let's read this to reimagine Anthem Church as we go into our third year together. And the point I want to make is this, is that healthy churches follow this 16-step recipe to making a loving community so that the world encounters God's love in us. This passage is like a recipe for the church to represent God's love. And so the key to grasping this chapter is the context. You might have heard this section of scripture retold at a wedding. And it's not a self-contained poem to be celebrated at a wedding, although that's a great place to celebrate love. It's actually addressing a problem. It's addressing a disunity, because the people of this church weren't loving each other. They had ministries. They weren't loving each other through the ministries of the church. And so this list was to convict them. It was for them to reveal what needed to change. And so he got specific for really two reasons. One is that just the word itself, which in the Greek is agape, it means high regard. And so by itself, the word is vague. It's not enough to convey the divine love that's needed to unite this church. And so he wanted to be more specific. And that's why he really defines love in these verses. Now, the second reason he got specific is because the culture around the church had a different definition of love. It was more about self-love. And so unless Paul defined love as God defines love, they're going to lose their identity and they're going to start to reflect the world's image, not God's image. And so Paul intended the church to understand all 16 aspects of love. Some are positive, some are things not to do, some are skills. And it's not to shame the church, it's to show them the full scope of God's love for us, God's divine, complete love that we're made to reflect as his church. Our kids are always teaching me new words. I learned a new word called Riz. They'll have to tell you about it, but it reminded me as a kid how we created our own language. When I was a kid, sick was kind of the word that we used to describe something positive, which confused my mom because she understood sick to be a negative term. It really shows how words can change meaning over time. I remember the word nice is really popular. In Minnesota, where I'm from, Minnesota nice is really the mantra of the state. Nice actually used to mean silly or foolish. It wasn't a compliment. The word awful used to be mean worthy of love. Now it means a negative thing. And so the same can be true in terms that we use in the church. Think about discipleship. It's really become a word to mean the spiritual growth of Christians. And when you think about Jesus' call to make disciples, the starting point is outside the church, non-disciples, to make them into disciples. And so that word discipleship has really lost its evangelistic starting point. The word calling, people talk about it like this task that's a mystery for what they're supposed to do with life. And if you really look at the word calling in the New Testament, it's more about called into relationship with God, and he leads us to live out his task that he has for us. And so we can change meaning for words that we use in the church over time, and it starts to lose God's original intent. And so for what we're looking at, the world needs to understand God's definition of love. It can't be my definition. People don't need me. They need Christ's love indwelling in me. And it's so that together, individually and collectively as a church, that we function as God designed us to be. I think about how our family loves food. And that's why I think about this section of scripture as like a recipe, ingredients for what God wants to make the church. And I think about foods that we love, and one of those is rice. And growing up, I did not like rice. Growing up, we made it out of this box called Uncle Ben's rice, and I didn't like it. It didn't really taste to me. And so I'd always just kind of leave it on the plate and focus on the meat and potatoes that we would get with the rice. And as I joined a Filipino family, rice is a big part of the meals. And I remember when we started as a family, I told my wife I don't like rice. And what's interesting though, as I started to have jasmine rice, I started to realize like, oh, I wasn't having the same kind of rice. And so I was evaluating this food based on my experience, not on what her experience of this food is. And so in a similar way, I think we can not want to be a part of a church because of an experience we had that isn't what God intended as according to his word. And so what I want us to do is to really make sure that we're creating an experience of a church based on this definition with God's Spirit in us, leading us and working in us. It's not going to be perfect. It's though the standard that we want to move towards. And so let's follow Paul's recipe for an ideal church. And I ask for you to reflect on each ingredient and consider, where are you at in light of this definition? Is there an area of growth? Make that your prayer. And make that your prayer for us as a church, because I think it's something that we're all in on in working towards really making a church based on this recipe of love. Now, just to outline this briefly, as you look at these verses, the starting point again is verse 1-3, and he's kind of speaking into ideas they had for the church, and so then he says, well, this is the ideal is love. There's the must-haves. There's 2 of them in verse 4. Then there's the not-haves. There's 7 of them in verses 4-5. And then there's 2 techniques in verse 6. Verse 7, there's best practices. And then verse 8, there's kind of the final word. And so let's start with the must-haves, the main ingredients of our dish called the church. Now, it's passive and active interpersonal skills that are needed to nourish a community to feel loved. And so they're patient and kind. Patient is more passive, kind is more active. Patient receives injury without retaliation. So you're enduring suffering, you're enduring wrongdoing with goodwill. It's kind of like you have a long fuse before you get angry. You are patient. And so that's the passive interpersonal skill. The active is to be kind. And that's where you respond to needs with tangible help that meets those needs. That's key, is kindness is aware of the needs and meets those needs. You see a person's humanity and you serve them. And so you're not waiting, and it's not about you, it's about what they need. That's kindness, that's patience. I kind of refer to this as the sticky rice that holds us together. And so it could be something like taking time to listen. Not that you're thinking about something else, not that you're listening to make a point, you're listening to really hear them out. You overlook an offense. Someone says something unkind, and you are patient with them. You look for and meet needs. If I had to explain what kindness and patience is, for those that remember Judy, she embodies this. And it comes from a story of great suffering, of difficulty. You ever hear a testimony that she shared? It's not a love that's surface level. It comes from her learning how to love in a really difficult background. And she's very patient. She's very kind. We miss you, Judy. We love you. And I think that's who we want to be like, is that patient, kind example of Judy. Another example, you think about Moses in the Bible. He was God's instrument to deliver the Jews from oppression. And then he provided for their needs with kindness, the manna, God working through him, while enduring complaints of God's people. And so there's that patience. And so those are the main ingredients, kindness and patience. Now, the verse 4 and 5 are the not-haves. So the must-haves are patient, kind. The not-haves, the bad ingredients to avoid in every dish, are being envious, boastful, proud, rude, insistent, irritable, and resentful. And so let's walk through those must avoid bad ingredients for our church. First is envy. This is where you want what others have. You're not content. You can't appreciate what you've received. You can't even appreciate other people's achievements. You want what they have. And so you're seeking status. You want to elevate yourself based on where they're at. The second one is boasting, where you're heaping praise on oneself. You're quick to assume credit regardless of the impact on other people. You seek recognition. You want people to see your greatness. The next one is pride. That's an exaggerated self-conception. And this was a big issue in this church. This is one of the things that in 1 John talks about are the ways of the world is the boastful pride of life. And so pride is a big issue in this church. Is mentioned 6 times in this letter. And it's really about making it about the attention that you want. And it's making it about you. You're not building others up. You're focusing it towards what you think is most important, which is yourself. The fourth one is being rude. These are indecent acts, being inconsiderate or even disrespectful of community norms. And so what's hard about this is community norms can be often cultural. And so you have to be sensitive to the different values that are expressed in that community. And for our church being a multicultural church, this is really challenging and requires the Holy Spirit to move through us so that we're being considerate of one another. And so being rude is really disruptive. You're just wanting to offend people. You're inconsiderate of others. Number 5 is being insistent, forcefully asking or requiring something. And this can be done actively or passively, where you just don't let up. You keep pushing. And so you're acting without regard of others. You're really autonomous. You're really wanting your way, and you're seeking your way, irregardless of the effect on others. 2 more, irritable. You're easily provoked by others. There could be words that are really sharp, and it could be that you're really quick to get angry. You might add tension by assuming the worst. You're not really seeing the best in others. You're really looking for the negative. That's being irritable. Resentful is the last one. You're striving to get even. There's no forgiveness. It literally means that you're keeping score of others' wrongs and hurts towards you. And so you hold on to those past hurts. You don't let them go by giving them to God. And so you're really seeking harm of others. And so I kind of see these as those expired ingredients that we need to let go and give to God. They make us feel sick. And it's really, as you think about them, it's really about a heart issue. It's seeking oneself. It's about your passion and what you want. It's not people driven. It's selfish. I think about in the Bible, Haman in the story of Esther. And he was really the antagonist of the story, but he's the antagonist towards community. He had an insatiable need for himself, and he made it about himself. He was a lover of pleasure. He hated the good of God's people. And so he's a good example of the bad ingredients that we don't need in our church. And so just as the quality of the ingredients make the meal, our attitude and actions make our church. Just as the quality of the ingredients make the meal, our attitude and actions make our church. People can become sick of the church because of us, or they can enjoy God's church because of our attitude and actions. And so the quality of our church is defined by a kind-hearted and patient love. Why? This is God. He is compassionate. He is slow to anger, abounding in love, and he wants the world to encounter him through us, his church. And so good programs matter, good teaching, the skill of praying and singing. What matters most, though, are not the things that we do in terms of ministries. It's how we love others through those ministries. It's because we want to cultivate a relationship with people. We want ultimately people to be changed by God's love. And so a healthy church overflows with God's love to one another and our neighbor. And I think for me, I mentioned that I'm from Minnesota, and you've heard maybe the mantra, Minnesota nice. And I remember hearing that and thinking, well, yeah, people can be smiling and they can look kind and patient on the outside, but inside it's different and it's not their heart. And so it can be fake. And that's why for us, we need to get at the heart of the matter and make sure that this is driven by God's love that we've received and are receiving through his Spirit. And it's through his work in us that we overflow with his love towards others. And so I think for us, let's just start small. What's a small act of kindness you can pray about and as God leads you to love someone this week with this small act of kindness? It could be an encouraging text. It could be dropping off a meal. It could be that you pray for someone and then ask them how to pray for them. It could be a real smile, being genuine. And I'm not advocating for this kind of Hollywood definition of kindness. This isn't the Ellen DeGeneres show. We're talking about God's kind-hearted, patient love that transforms people. Romans 2:4 says, God's kindness leads to radical life change. God's kindness leads to radical life change. As we imitate God, we're going to be led to love hurtful and hard people. And we show them the reality of our God's love, who changes people from the inside out, who loves people regardless of what they've done. And so God's kind-hearted, patient love in us can lead people into a life-transforming relationship with God. I think about a friend of mine at Bellevue College. He was a Buddhist, and he helped us with our ESL ministry, our talk time ministry there on campus. And as we were serving the needs of our international students, adult ESL students, we started to together start to have faith conversations. And he started to not just hear about who God is, as we did talk about him, he started to see his love in us. And that had as much or more of an effect on him to redefine his view of God and his church based on our love for those that had needs. And so, who is God leading you to love? As we follow Jesus, he transforms us to love others like him. And it just takes a small act of kindness. Now, once we identify the quality ingredients to love others well, then we need to focus on the techniques to avoid burning others through the church. And so you can have all the good stuff, and then you don't do it well. And so that's what the next sections are about. Paul moves from defining to describing. It's not what love is, it's what love does. It's about skills. And so verse 6 are 2 techniques, and then verse 7 are 4 best practices, and then verse 8 is the final word. And so let's look at the 2 techniques. Now these are techniques for loving hard people. And so the reason for that is because brokenness is inevitable. God draws broken people into the church. And as we love others, it's not going to always be easy. And so that's going to give us reason to avoid people. And so these techniques are to help us engage people, even if they're hard to love. And the 2 things that we need to do are we need to see and celebrate God's work. Let's look at that together. He says, rejoice with the truth. What this means is that you're delighting in the good moments that you see in the church. As you're seeing people love people well, that you're recognizing that and you're celebrating that. You see the good moments. You're rejoicing with the reality of God's love being expressed through his church. And so as people love well, we should celebrate the truth of that situation and appreciate them, not taking people for granted and assuming that's expected. Now, it's not just rejoicing with the truth, it's also not to rejoice at wrongdoing. And so that's not to enjoy the bad moments, it's the opposite side. So if there's negative moments, we shouldn't enjoy those. We shouldn't take delight in people being hurt. And so we can't tolerate hate. We can't tolerate unkindness. And in those moments, we need to speak truth in love. And so to describe the reality, you just to say, like, when I saw this negative, unkindness, this is what it did for this person. And so you need to speak truth in love. It's 2 sides of the same coin, because again, the reality is we're going to have brokenness in the church. And the church needs positive pressure. That's what Paul's saying in this technique. We need to see God's work being accomplished in people's lives. Little examples can add up to a lot. And so we need to celebrate those things. And honestly, it's because we become who we celebrate. We become what we celebrate. So if we're celebrating God's work being accomplished in someone as they love well, that's going to change the culture. It's going to celebrate, and we're going to become that because that's what everyone's talking about. That's why for me, every meeting, I like to start by celebrating good news. And it's not to be flippant. It's not to be surface level about it. It's just so easy to focus on the broken parts. It's so easy to focus on what we lack. And so we need to see the good that God is doing. And not to as an example, we can focus on how there might be not enough kids in our kids ministry because we're a small church. Let's focus on the kids who God has brought here and what he's doing through our teachers. I heard stories of individualized personal discipleship happening in Sunday school that I love to hear because we're meeting people where they're at. And that's the beauty of being smaller, is we can see people, and those teachers in our kids ministry can meet those kids where they're at and to love them and to listen and to make time for them. And so let's be a church that celebrates the wins that God is creating and to really be about that positive pressure. Now, those are the techniques for hard people. Then it's about best practices in verse 7. And this is for all people. The reason is it's hard to love consistently, repeatedly, over a long period of time. We can do it for a little bit, but over time, we can start to take each other for granted as we sacrifice our time, as we sacrifice our finances, as we sacrifice our emotional energy at the end of a hard day to be in a situation where not only am I not going to be filled, I'm going to feel drained. And so that's why next week, we're going to talk about that more, is we need to overflow with God's love to us, to others. What I'm saying here, though, is there's a skill to loving people for the long haul. And so we need these best practices. And so true love will bear, believe, hope, and endure. It'll bear all things, believe all things, hope, and endure. And the key in these words is confidence in God's love to transform people. And when we have that confidence to believe that God's working, then we never give up. We believe what's possible in people. We see their potential. We hope for the best. And we can keep trying. We don't give up. And it's because relationships get hard. And so as we're a new growing church, we have to trust God in these moments that might cause us to want to give up. And it's because God, who loves us on our worst day, our God who transforms people and sees the potential in people, we need to be an embodiment of his love in the church, to love people on their worst day, to see people's potential, and to not grow tired of supporting each other. I think of a story in a previous ministry serving young adults. And I remember we had a Christmas party. We were very excited about it. It was at our home. We're still a new, smaller group. And we had visitors come. And we asked, what is, just an icebreaker, what are some of the jobs that you've done? And so people would go around like, oh, I've been a teacher. I did, construction work. I was a barista. I did babysitting. And it came to this individual that you could kind of tell he was a bit more abrasive. And he liked to kind of agitate things, say the extreme thing. And so sure enough, he starts saying, well, I've done everything. I've been a teacher. I've been a barista. I've been a mail stripper. I've been an accountant. I've been a nurse. And I was like, wait, hold on. Like, did I hear mail stripper? I mean, it just was disruptive. And so we heard it and we just kind of moved along and we started to get to know him. And he kept showing up and we were prepared. We were like, okay, we care about him because God cares about him. He cares about us. And so let's be that community that loves him well. So every week he'd create disruption, wanting to talk about an extreme situation that wasn't even about what we were talking about in the Bible study that we're having. And so it was hard. But we kept just kind of, okay, God, we can do this because you're loving us. We can overflow to him. And I remember months later, I met him for lunch. And I remember he looked at me, and as we were connecting and I shared, I'm so glad that you're part of our ministry. I just want to hear some explanation. You've said some extreme things. Male stripper, like, tell me about that, but not specific. How did you get into that? And as we were talking, he actually said, I actually wasn't. I said that because I just want to get people's attention. And he said to me, the thing that stood out was he thought this meeting that we're having was because I was going to tell him, you're no longer welcome. And he's had that at other churches. And I remember just putting myself in his shoes, just thinking, man, what is going on here? It's bigger than what we're seeing. That there's a person, a human being who is trying to cry out for someone to love him. And I think that reminds me that it's not always easy. It's not always easy to love people for the long haul. It's easy to give up. There's lots of reasons. People are going to hurt us. People are going to say things that are inappropriate. And we need to, as a family, committed to God, make this our recipe for the church that God is making at Anthem Church. As a family, God is committed to us. And as God's family, we need to be committed to one another through the good and the bad meals that are made. And so some weeks might go better than others. And so let's keep journeying together, keep committed, being committed to each other through the good and the hard. And that's again because the church is going to attract broken people who find healing and need healing and wholeness in Jesus. And so our ideal church cannot be without conflict. There's going to be broken people who come. God's ideal church has people who love each other for the long haul because they're dependent on God and reflect his loving commitment to others. I think about the story of the Bible and how the number one covenant maker in the Bible who's making commitments to people is God. He was faithful. He is faithful. He is always going to be faithful because he loves us with a sincere, genuine love. And so for us, let's develop 2 skills to build long-lasting love in our church. Let's celebrate as people love one another well. And let's keep showing up. You know, a friend of mine said that 80% of ministry is showing up, and I believe it. You know, at the Bible school I was telling you about, we'd have these weekly camp highs that I love. They're exciting. People came and their lives were disrupted by Jesus, and it really caught their attention, and they left going back home different. It's exciting to have those highs, and it's also not sustainable. And it can also, if we feel that that's what's expected, it's not reality. We need to be able to journey with people through the highs and the lows of life. And church gives us an opportunity to build relationships that last, that are bonded together with God's love, as we read about here in 1 Corinthians 13. And so let's show up. Let's celebrate God's work. Because as in good meals, there's no shortcuts to good relationships. The quality of our love has the final word. And that's verse 8. Love never ends. That's God's love for us. True love has the final word. And so will you keep showing up? Will you celebrate what God's doing? We are a broken people being changed by God's love, his work in us that is our source, is our strength to love hard and hurtful people. And so what gets you up on a Sunday morning? For me, it's God's love expressed through his church. It's you. You make me want to come to Anthem Church on a Sunday morning. You are my ideal church. And for Paul, the church must unite around this recipe of love. And so let's unite around this recipe of love. Let's see God make a church that's defined by this recipe of love as he's changing us, as he's working in us, this 16 ingredient process for building a loving community. Let's add kindness into our church. Let's be patient. Let's be sending encouraging texts. Let's drop off meals. Let's listen. Let's share our needs. Let's look for ways that we can help one another. And then let's keep showing up. Let's celebrate what God's doing, looking for his work in one another, seeing the potential that God sees in others, even if it's hard, because God's love never fails. And so let's be about God's definition of love at Anthem Church.